Introduction. Viktor Frankl was a Viennese psychiatrist who, in 1945, sat down and wrote this book in 9 straight days. He meant to publish it anonymously under nothing but his prison number. He had just survived 3 years inside the Nazi concentration camps, Auschwitz among them, where his parents, his brother, and his pregnant wife were killed. The book has 2 halves that lean on each other. The first is a memoir, an account, not of the great horrors everyone has heard of, but of the small, daily torments, and of what they did to the mind of an ordinary prisoner. The second is the outline of the theory of the mind that Frankl built, called Logotherapy, from the Greek word for meaning, and later known as the third great Viennese school of psychotherapy, after those of Freud and Adler. He wrote the memoir to make a single point concrete: that life holds a possible meaning under any conditions, even the most miserable ones. If that could be shown true in a place as extreme as a death camp, he thought it might be believed anywhere. And the question behind it all is not abstract. Millions of people, he noticed, reach for a book whose very title promises to speak about the meaning of life, which told him the question burns under their fingernails. Frankl's answer reverses the way we usually ask. We tend to ask what we can expect from life. He learned, in the camps, to ask instead what life expects from us. Meaning, for him, is never a grand idea handed down from above. It is concrete and particular, waiting in each situation for the one person who can answer it. There is a story he tells about why he stayed in Vienna when he might have fled. He had an American visa in hand, and aging parents who would be left behind. Torn, he found at home a fragment of marble his father had saved from a burned synagogue, a piece of the stone tablets, carved with a single commandment: honor your father and your mother. He let the visa lapse and stayed. What follows is what he carried out of that darkness. Experiences in a concentration camp. Chapter 1. The shock of arrival. 1,500 people had been packed onto a train for days, 80 to a car, lying on the last of their belongings. No one knew where they were going. Then someone read a sign through the dawn, and a single word went down the carriage like a current: Auschwitz. Every heart stopped. The name already stood for everything unspeakable: gas chambers, crematoria, mass death. Frankl describes a strange first reaction that psychiatry has a name for: the delusion of reprieve. A condemned man, just before his execution, begins to believe he might be spared at the last moment. The new arrivals clung to exactly that. The prisoners who met the train looked well-fed and even cracked jokes, and Frankl's stubborn optimism whispered that perhaps it would not be so bad. It was the cruelest delusion in the camp. On the platform came the first selection. An officer stood at ease and, with one finger, pointed each person to the right or to the left, a casual little motion no one understood. To the right meant work. To the left meant the gas chambers that same day. For about 90 in every 100, the finger pointed left. Frankl asked later that evening where his friend had been sent. A hand pointed at a chimney pouring fire into the sky, and he was told, "That is where your friend is now." Then came the cleansing station and the methodical stripping away of every last thing. Watches and rings were handed to suddenly charming guards. Frankl still carried the one possession he could not imagine losing: the manuscript of his first book, his life's work, hidden in his coat. He begged an older prisoner to help him keep it. The man looked at him. A grin spread slowly across his face, and he answered with the single obscene word that was always on the lips of the camp: meaning your old life is over. In that instant, Frankl says, he struck out his whole former life. Within minutes they were ordered to undress completely, were shaved of every hair, and stood under the showers, absurdly relieved that real water came out. They had nothing now but their bare bodies. Everything that had tied them to who they used to be was gone, the name replaced by a number, the history erased, the future unimaginable. And yet something odd surfaced through the horror. A grim humor, and a cold curiosity about what the body could survive. Textbooks lie, they discovered. A man can endure far more than any book says. Nearly everyone thought, at least once, of running into the wire, the electrified fence that was the camp's quickest exit. Frankl made himself a promise that first night not to do it. The shock had a strange floor to it. Once you have lost everything, even the gas chamber loses some of its terror. This was the first phase, and it ended the moment a man's old self was struck out and something barer took its place. Chapter 2. The Living Dead, Apathy in the Camp. After the shock came something stranger and, in its way, more frightening. Frankl calls it the second phase, a kind of emotional death. The feelings simply went numb. A prisoner who, on his first day, had to look away from a beating now watched the same scene without a flicker. The dying and the dead became ordinary furniture. Frankl describes lying in a hut for typhus patients when one of them died. One by one the others came to the still warm body. One took his shoes, another his coat, another the scraps of his last meal. Frankl watched, felt nothing, and went on sipping his soup, while the corpse that had just been dragged out stared back at him through the window. 2 hours earlier he had been talking with that man. This numbness, he insists, was not cruelty. It was a shell the soul grew in order to survive. Underneath it, the prisoner had been forced down to the most primitive level of need. Beatings came on the slightest pretext or none, and the wound that cut deepest was never the physical blow but the insult inside it. Frankl tells of a foreman who looked him over and sneered that he was a pig, probably some businessman who had never done a day's real work. When Frankl said he was a doctor who had often treated the poor for nothing, the man knocked him down. What stung was not the pain. It was being judged, contemptuously, by someone who knew nothing of the life he was condemning. Hunger ruled everything. Men dug ditches and talked endlessly of food, trading recipes for meals they might eat after liberation. They dreamed of bread and warm baths. The mind shrank to the size of its appetites. Frankl noticed that they had stopped feeling desire of any other kind. The whole self had narrowed to staying alive one more day. He calls it a regression, a retreat to a cruder form of life. They became, he writes, like a flock of sheep, herded one way and another, thinking only of how to dodge the blows and where the next mouthful might come from. The camp's first law of self-preservation was simple: do not be conspicuous. Disappear into the middle of the crowd. Once, the train carrying Frankl passed through Vienna, his own city, at midnight. It crawled past the very street where he was born, the house where he had lived. He begged the others at the barred window to let him look, just for a moment, and they cynically refused. He felt, he says, like a dead man looking down on a ghost city from another world. That was the second phase, not the loud horror people picture, but a slow, gray deadening, the price the mind paid to keep its bearer breathing. Chapter 3. The Last of the Human Freedoms. This is the heart of the book, the discovery Frankl made in the worst place on earth. Even there, stripped of everything, a person was not entirely without freedom. 3 things, he found, could still reach a man. The first was love. On a black winter morning, stumbling to a work site under the guards' blows, Frankl's mind fixed on the image of his wife, her face, her smile, her look. And a thought pierced him: that love is the highest goal a human being can reach, that the salvation of man is through love and in love. A man with nothing left in the world can still know joy, if only for a moment, in the contemplation of the one he loves. He did not even know whether she was still alive, and it did not matter, he writes, because love reaches beyond the physical person of the beloved. The second was beauty. Prisoners on a transport once crowded to the barred windows to watch the mountains of Salzburg glow in the sunset. One evening a man rushed into the hut and made the others come out to see the clouds burning over the gray barracks, and someone said quietly, "How beautiful the world could be." The third was humor, what Frankl calls another weapon of the soul. He and a friend promised each other to invent one funny story a day about their life after liberation. Humor, even for a few seconds, let a man rise above his situation. But the deepest discovery was this. Frankl watched men walk through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They were few, but they were enough to prove something. Everything can be taken from a person but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's own attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. The Nazis could take his work, his health, his family, his name. They could not take the stance he chose toward what was done to him. And there was always a choice. Every day offered a decision about whether you would let the camp own your inner self. Frankl leaned on a line from Nietzsche, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow." The men who knew there was a meaning waiting for them, a person or a task, were the likeliest to survive. Those who saw nothing ahead collapsed first. What was needed, he says, was nothing less than a reversal in how the prisoners thought about life. It did not matter what they still expected from life. What mattered was what life expected from them. They had to stop asking the question and grasp that they themselves were being questioned, daily, hourly, and could answer only by their conduct, by taking responsibility for the task in front of them. And when a man's task is to suffer, then suffering becomes his work, his single and unique assignment, which no one can take from him or do in his place. Dostoevsky had written of one dread only, not to be worthy of one's sufferings. Frankl saw men who were worthy of theirs. He remembered a young woman, dying, who was strangely at peace. Through the hut window she could see one branch of a chestnut tree with 2 blossoms on it. That tree, she said, was the only friend she had in her loneliness, and she spoke to it. He asked gently whether it answered. Yes, she said. It told her, I am here. I am life, eternal life. That was the freedom no guard could reach. Chapter 4. Liberation and the Return. One morning a white flag rose over the camp gate. The war had reached them. It was over. And here Frankl says something surprising. The prisoners did not go mad with joy. They walked out on tired legs, looked at the meadows full of flowers, and felt nothing. They had dreamed of freedom so long that the word had worn smooth. Now that it was real, it would not sink in. Psychologically, he calls this depersonalization. Everything seemed unreal, like a dream a man could not quite believe. They had to learn, slowly, how to feel pleased again. Then came 2 dangers Frankl watched damage men who had survived everything else. The first was moral. Some, suddenly free, decided that because wrong had been done to them, they were now free to do wrong themselves. Walking across a field, a friend pulled Frankl straight through the young green crops. When Frankl objected, the man shouted that his wife and child had been gassed, and now Frankl would begrudge him a few stalks of oats. Only slowly, he says, could such men be led back to a plain truth, that no one has the right to do wrong, not even someone to whom great wrong has been done. The second danger waited at home. It was bitterness, the man who came back and was met with a shrug, with "we did not know and we suffered too," until he wondered why he had endured any of it. And it was disillusionment, the discovery that fate could still strike. The person whose memory had kept him alive was, for some, no longer there. The home pictured through 1,000 nights stood empty. A man who thought he had reached the limit of all suffering learned that suffering has no limit, that he could suffer still more. Out of all this Frankl draws a hard, clear conclusion about human beings. There are not many kinds of people, he says. There are only 2, the decent and the indecent, and the line between them runs through every group, through the guards and through the prisoners alike. Some guards showed quiet kindness. Some prisoners brutalized their own. No class, no uniform is purely one or the other. The division cuts through us all, down to the very bottom. And the crowning experience, for the man who finally comes home, is the wonderful certainty that, after all he has suffered, there is nothing left he needs to fear, except his God. One day, walking through flowering country, the larks rising and singing above him, Frankl knelt down. He had only one sentence in his mind, repeated again and again. I called to the Lord from my narrow prison, and he answered me in the freedom of space. That, he writes, was the hour his new life began, and step by step he became a human being again. Logotherapy in a nutshell. Chapter 5. The Will to Meaning. The second half of the book turns from the camp to the clinic, where Frankl lays out the theory the camp had tested. He called it logotherapy, from the Greek word logos, meaning. It became known as the Third Viennese School of Psychotherapy, after those of Freud and Adler, and each school rests on a different idea of what most deeply drives a human being. Freud put the will to pleasure at the center, Adler the will to power. Frankl proposed a third, the will to meaning, the claim that the primary force in a person's life is the search for something worth living for. People will live and even die for their ideals. That, he says, is not a mask for some hidden drive. It is the drive. When that search is blocked, Frankl speaks of existential frustration. It is not, in itself, a sickness. A person wrestling with whether his life has meaning is not ill. He is being human. Sometimes, though, the frustration does produce a real disorder, what logotherapy calls a noogenic neurosis, a suffering that rises not from the mind but from the spirit, from the unanswered question of meaning. Frankl insists that meaning is no luxury. There is nothing in the world, he writes, that so helps a person survive the worst conditions as the knowledge that his life holds a meaning. A healthy mind is not one without tension. It is one stretched between what a person is and what he could still become. The dangerous modern error, he argues, is to think people need a life free of all tension, a kind of inner stillness. What they actually need is a worthwhile task that calls to them. Against that, he sets the great sickness of our age, what he names the existential vacuum, the feeling that life is empty and means nothing. Two losses opened it. The animal instincts that once told our ancestors what to do are gone, and the traditions that long told people what they ought to do are fading fast. So the modern person often does not know what he wants. He does what others do, which is conformism, or what others want him to do, which is the road to every kind of tyranny. This emptiness shows itself, most plainly, as boredom. Frankl points to what he calls the Sunday neurosis, the low, anxious mood that descends when the busy week stops and the silence inside a person becomes audible. The vacuum wears disguises. A frustrated will to meaning is often filled instead with a will to power, or its crudest form, the will to money, or with a will to pleasure, where the empty space fills up with sensation. Depression, aggression, addiction. Frankl traces all three again and again, back to this hollow at the center. The point is not abstract. A person can have everything to live on, he says, and still have nothing to live for. Chapter 6. The Meaning of Life, Love, and Suffering. People ask Frankl what the meaning of life is, in general, and he answers that the question put that way has no answer. It is like asking a chess champion for the best move in the world. There is no best move in the abstract. There is only the best move in this position, in this game. Meaning is never general. It is concrete and particular. The specific meaning of one person's life at one moment that no one else can fulfill and that will never come again. And so the famous question can be turned around. We should not ask what we want from life. We should grasp that life is asking us, and that we answer by being responsible, by giving the right reply to the task in front of us. There are, Frankl says, 3 roads to meaning. The first is to create a work or do a deed, to give something to the world. The second is to experience something or someone, above all, to love. Love, in his account, is the only way to grasp another person at the very core of his being, to see not just who he is but who he could become. The third road is the hardest and the most important, because it stays open even when the other 2 are shut. It is the stand we take toward unavoidable suffering. When we can no longer change a situation, Frankl gives the example of an incurable illness, we are challenged to change ourselves. This is where a person can turn a personal tragedy into a triumph, can make of a predicament a human achievement. He tells of an elderly doctor who came to him sunk in grief. The man's wife had died 2 years earlier, and he could not recover. Frankl did not argue. He asked him one question. What would have happened if you had died first, and she had been left to mourn you? Oh, the man said, for her it would have been terrible, how she would have suffered. And Frankl answered, you see, she has been spared that suffering, and it was you who spared her, at the price that now you must mourn her. The man said nothing, shook Frankl's hand, and left in peace. Nothing about his loss had changed. What changed was its meaning. The suffering had become a sacrifice for the woman he loved, and a sacrifice can be borne. This, Frankl says, is the secret. Suffering stops being mere suffering the moment it finds a meaning. He is careful here. Suffering is not necessary for meaning, and pain that can be removed should be removed. To suffer needlessly is not heroic. But when sorrow cannot be escaped, it still leaves a person one freedom, how to bear it. And life keeps its meaning to the very last, because even that final stance, the way a person meets what cannot be changed, is itself an achievement. Chapter 7. Tragedy into Triumph. Having shown what meaning is, Frankl turns to method, how logotherapy actually helps. He starts with a trap he calls anticipatory anxiety. The fear of a thing brings the thing about. A man afraid he will blush, blushes. A man afraid he cannot sleep, lies awake. And the harder we chase certain experiences, the more they flee. Pleasure pursued directly is pleasure spoiled. His first technique turns this around. He calls it paradoxical intention. The patient is asked to wish for, even to exaggerate, the very thing he dreads. A doctor terrified of sweating was told, next time, to show people how much he could really sweat, to aim for 10 quarts. The fear, robbed of its grip, collapsed. A phobia of 4 years lifted in a week. It works, Frankl notes, because a person can laugh at himself. Humor lets him step back from his own neurosis. The companion technique is dereflection. The cure for too much self-watching is to stop watching the self and to turn outward, toward a task or another person. The thread running through both is what he calls self-transcendence. A person becomes most himself when he forgets himself in something beyond himself. Then Frankl makes his stand against an idea he finds dangerous, what he calls pandeterminism. The belief that a human being is nothing but the product of heredity, environment, and circumstance. He does not deny that we are shaped by all three. He is, he says, a professor in 2 fields and knows how conditioned we are, but he is also a survivor of 4 camps, and bears witness to how far a person can defy even the worst conditions. Freedom, in his account, is not freedom from conditions. It is the freedom to take a stand toward them. Man, he writes, does not simply exist. He decides what his existence will be. As proof, Frankl offers a haunting case. He knew a doctor once called the mass murderer of a Vienna asylum, who had sent his own patients to the gas. Years later, a fellow prisoner reported meeting that same man in a Soviet prison, where he had died, and where, to the end, he had been the best comrade imaginable, consoling everyone, living by the highest moral standard. If that man could change, no one's future can be simply predicted. But freedom, Frankl warns, is only half the truth. Freedom without responsibility decays into mere whim. That is why, he says, the Statue of Liberty on one coast should be answered by a statue of responsibility on the other. All of this points, finally, toward what he calls a rehumanized psychiatry, one that sees not a damaged machine to be repaired but a person free and responsible to the last. In the camps, he reminds us, some men behaved like swine and others like saints. The same human being holds both, and which one comes out is decided not by conditions but by choice. Man is the being who invented the gas chambers, and also the being who walked into them upright, a prayer on his lips. Conclusion. The case for a tragic optimism. Frankl ends with a phrase that sounds like a contradiction: tragic optimism. It means staying open to life in spite of what he calls the tragic triad, the three hardest facts of human existence: pain, guilt, and death. The whole book builds to one question, and he asks it plainly: how can a person still say yes to life in spite of all that? His answer is that life can be made meaningful even here. At his best, the human being can do three things with what hurts. He can turn suffering into an achievement, take from guilt the chance to become a better person, and take from life's passing the spur to do something responsible now. Optimism, Frankl warns, cannot be ordered up on command. You cannot force yourself to be happy. Happiness has to ensue, to follow as the side effect of a reason to be happy. The same is true of hope. So the task is never to command good feeling but to find the meaning that lets it come. He saw in the camps what happens when meaning collapses. The men who gave up lay down and within days were gone. And he sees a quieter version of the same surrender in the modern world. A generation with the means to live but no meaning to live for, filling the emptiness with what he calls the mass neurosis of our time. Against it, he holds up the granaries of the past. We tend to see only life's stubble field, the things slipping away. We forget that everything we have done, loved, and bravely suffered is harvested safely into the past, where nothing can touch it. To have been is the surest kind of being. From this, Frankl draws a fierce defense of human dignity. A person's worth is not the same as his usefulness. A society that values people only for what they produce, that adores the young, the successful, the efficient, has confused dignity with use, and that confusion, he reminds us, is exactly the logic that ends in the gas chamber. Every life keeps its worth to the last, because that worth rests on what a person has already realized, not on what he can still do. And he refuses to let the worst be the final word about us. The camps proved what a human being is capable of, but the same camps held the decent and even the saintly, the few who walked through the huts giving away their last bread. They are always a minority, he admits, and always will be. He sees in that the very challenge to join the minority of the decent. The world is in a bad state, he writes, and will only grow worse unless each of us does his best. So he leaves us alert in two directions at once. Since Auschwitz, we know what human beings are capable of. And since Hiroshima, we know what is at stake.